Welcome to Eternal Night Feel. Tonight, we're bringing you 3 spine-chilling blackout horror stories that will leave you questioning what hides in the darkness. Imagine being alone, surrounded by pitch black, then hearing footsteps that shouldn't be there, or seeing shadows moving in the corner of your eye. These are real experiences of terror, a home invasion in the dead of night, a stormy night's encounter in a basement, and a horrifying warehouse incident on a lonely night shift. So, turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself. Because sometimes the scariest things happen when the power goes out. The nightmare of a blackout night. Jack was an ordinary man who lived with his wife, Kate, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. One evening after dinner, Jack was resting alone in the living room. A strong wind was howling outside, and the sound of an approaching storm surrounded the house. Kate had already gone to bed, and Jack sat there reading a book, but he couldn't shake off an unsettling feeling, like something was trying to warn him. Suddenly, all the lights in the house went out. It was a blackout, and everything was immediately plunged into darkness and silence. Jack wasn't too concerned at first. Power outages were common during storms. He reached for his phone on the table to turn on the flashlight, but his battery was nearly dead. Sitting there in the dark, Jack wondered whether to wake Kate. A few minutes passed, and then he heard an odd sound. It was faint, like someone's footsteps slowly coming up the steps outside. He thought it could be the wind blowing something against the stairs, but the sound was too distinct and rhythmic to ignore. A sense of fear started creeping in, yet Jack tried to dismiss it. After a few seconds, he decided to go to the kitchen and pick up something to defend himself just in case. As he was holding a knife, he noticed the security light outside his house flicker on. The light cast a dim glow into the living room, and as he moved closer to the window to check, he saw a shadow dart past. Jack's heart began to race. He quickly locked the front door and went back to the living room, where he started hearing those footsteps again. Only this time, they were closer, like someone was already inside, walking around him. Kate was still asleep, and Jack knew he had to wake her up. Carefully, he went to their bedroom and gently shook Kate awake, whispering, "There's someone in the house. Stay quiet and hide." Startled but trusting Jack, Kate slipped behind the dresser to hide, while Jack slowly crept back towards the hallway. Then he spotted a beam of light moving through the darkness near the front door. Now he knew for sure. Someone had entered the house on purpose. The flashlight was getting closer, shining under the crack of the door, and Jack felt himself freeze in terror. A chilling voice broke the silence, calling softly, "Jack! Jack, are you asleep?" Every part of Jack's body went numb. Someone knew his name. They were calling for him. Trying to stay calm, he tightened his grip on the knife and backed away to hide in the shadows. He could hear the footsteps linger at his door, pausing like the person was listening carefully. Moments later, the shadow moved away, and he could hear it whispering, "You'll never be safe, Jack." After several more minutes of dead silence, Jack mustered the courage to check the house. By the time he and Kate emerged, the intruder was gone, and when the police arrived, there was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had come had left no trace. That night left an indelible scar on Jack and Kate. No one could explain how the stranger knew Jack's name, nor why they had come, but to this day, Jack can still hear that voice in his mind, reminding him that he is never truly safe. Stormy night, basement, terror. Alex was a man in his late 20s who'd recently hit a rough patch in life. His job situation had become shaky, so he'd moved back to his parents' home, settling into their basement. He felt a bit discouraged about the move. It wasn't where he'd pictured himself at this point in life. Yet the basement was almost like its own little apartment. It had a small kitchen, a bathroom, a cozy bedroom, and even an old TV where he could play video games. It wasn't ideal, but it gave him the privacy he needed without feeling like he was intruding on his parents. One Friday night, his parents went out of town, leaving Alex with the house to himself. A storm was brewing, and he was actually looking forward to a quiet night. He loved the sound of rain against the windows, the occasional thunder, and the comfort of being tucked away in a warm bed while the storm raged outside. It was nearly midnight, and he'd finally decided to head to bed after binge-watching a few shows. As he lay in bed, the wind howled outside, bending the trees, and the rain hammered the windows. The entire house shook occasionally as gusts swept through the neighborhood. Just as Alex was about to drift off, the power suddenly went out. The quiet hum of the lights and the comforting noise of his fan disappeared, leaving him in a deep, pressing silence. He groaned, frustrated, but figured the storm had likely knocked out the power, and he didn't feel like messing with the breaker box in the middle of a storm. He decided to wait it out, hoping the power would come back soon. He lay back down, trying to get comfortable again, when he heard a sharp, heavy thud against one of the basement windows. It wasn't the type of sound you'd expect from a tree branch or something blowing in the wind. This noise was sharp, deliberate, and close, like someone had thrown a rock, or maybe even hit the glass with their hand. Alex's heart skipped a beat. The house was in a quiet neighborhood, and random visitors, especially at this hour, were rare. A mixture of dread and curiosity washed over him. He grabbed his phone, using the dim glow of its flashlight to navigate through the darkness. He approached the basement window, holding his breath. With every step closer, he half expected to see something terrifying staring back at him. But when he looked out, there was only darkness and the pounding rain. He told himself it must have been his imagination. With a deep breath, he started back toward his bed when he heard another sound. A faint creaking from above, like slow, careful footsteps on the main floor. He froze in place, his mind racing. His parents were gone, and he was alone in the house. The creaks sounded too intentional to be the house settling, and he hadn't heard them before. It was as if someone was trying to walk quietly, just above him. His body went cold. Thoughts raced through his mind. Maybe it was the wind, maybe it was just his nerves, maybe it was a burglar. Determined to figure out what was going on, he tiptoed back toward the stairs, making as little noise as possible. He stopped halfway up, listening intently, and that's when he saw a faint beam of light moving in the living room, reflecting off the walls. His stomach dropped. Someone was in his house, and they were armed with a flashlight. Panicking, he backed down the stairs quietly, retreating into the dark safety of the basement. His mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. He could call the police, but when he checked his phone, he realized with horror that he had no signal down there, and the power outage had knocked out the Wi-Fi. Alex felt trapped. He couldn't stay in the basement forever, but he also couldn't risk going upstairs and facing whoever was wandering around his house. Just then, he heard muffled voices from above. There were at least 2 intruders, and they seemed to be discussing something, their words barely audible. Alex strained to listen, catching only fragments. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the voices grew louder, and he realized they were coming closer. The footsteps moved toward the basement door. Alex's mind reeled as he thought through his options. He needed to hide, but there weren't many options in the basement. He spotted an old closet in the corner, filled with boxes and random storage items. Quietly, he slipped inside, pushing himself as far back as he could, barely daring to breathe. He heard the basement door creak open, followed by the soft thuds of footsteps descending the stairs. Alex's heart raced as he listened, each step louder than the last. He could see a sliver of light from the intruder's flashlight casting faint shadows across the floor through the narrow crack in the closet door. Whoever it was had reached the bottom of the stairs and was now standing just a few feet away from his hiding spot. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't open the closet. But then, to his horror, he heard one of the voices, clear and close. "Alex, we know you're down here. Why don't you come out?" His blood ran cold. How did they know his name? He hadn't made a sound, and he was sure he hadn't been seen. The voice was calm, almost mocking, as if they were playing a twisted game. Whoever was in his house knew him, and they weren't just here to rob him. He could feel his hands shaking as he pressed himself deeper into the closet, hoping they'd leave. After a few tense seconds, he heard the footsteps move away and the voices faded slightly as they went back up the stairs. He waited, still holding his breath, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the basement door closed, and he was left in silence. Alex didn't dare move. He stayed in the closet, too terrified to leave. Minutes passed, and he debated whether he should make a run for it. But before he could decide, he heard the footsteps return, this time even louder, as if they were stomping deliberately, taunting him. They called his name again, this time with an eerie sing-song tone. "Alex, come out wherever you are!" His mind was screaming with fear. He felt like he was in some horror movie, trapped and powerless. But this was real, and he was living it. He forced himself to stay calm, remembering there was one basement window he might be able to squeeze through. It was small and a few feet off the ground, but it was his only way out. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, he quietly slipped out of the closet, keeping low to the ground. The intruders were still making noise upstairs, their footsteps echoing throughout the house. He reached the window, carefully pushed it open, and began to climb up, squeezing his body through the narrow opening. Just as he was halfway out, he heard the basement door open again. He froze, his body half in and half out of the window, praying they wouldn't see him. But then, he felt a sudden grip on his ankle, cold and tight. One of them had caught him. In a burst of adrenaline-fueled panic, Alex kicked with all his might, freeing his leg from the intruder's grasp. He scrambled through the window, cutting his arms and legs on the sharp edges as he tumbled out into the rain-soaked yard. Without looking back, he sprinted through the mud, barely able to see through the downpour. His only thought was to get as far from the house as possible. After what felt like an eternity, he reached the end of the street where he finally found a signal on his phone and called the police. His voice shook as he explained the situation, and the police assured him they were on their way. When they arrived, the officers searched the house but found no sign of the intruders. There were muddy footprints and evidence of forced entry, but the people who had terrorized him were gone without a trace. To this day, Alex still doesn't know who they were or why they knew his name. And every time he thinks about that night, he feels a chill run down his spine. He never went back to the basement after that night. The scars from the broken glass have faded, but the memory of that night haunts him, a constant reminder of the terror he endured. He knows he'll never forget that feeling of helplessness, of being hunted in his own home by people who seem to know everything about him. Warehouse encounter. Ethan had never imagined himself working a graveyard shift as a security guard in an isolated warehouse. But after a series of job setbacks, he accepted the position, hoping it would be a temporary gig. The warehouse was enormous, filled with endless aisles of towering metal shelves, each crammed with boxes and machinery. It was a place that rarely saw much action, especially during the night shift. Ethan's job was simple: perform routine checks, make sure all the doors and windows were secure, and ensure everything stayed quiet. One Thursday night, the weather was especially nasty. A heavy rain pounded the warehouse roof, and gusts of wind rattled the massive metal shutters along the walls. Ethan had his phone out, checking the storm updates, hoping it would die down before his shift ended. As he strolled through the aisles, a flicker caught his eye. The overhead lights sputtered briefly, casting shadows that danced across the tall stacks of crates and boxes. Then, just as quickly, the entire warehouse went dark. The silence felt overwhelming. With a frustrated sigh, Ethan switched on his flashlight, the narrow beam of light barely cutting through the dense blackness. He knew he'd have to reset the circuit breaker, which meant walking to the far end of the building, through the labyrinthine aisles. As he made his way, the echo of his footsteps filled the cavernous space, louder than he'd ever noticed. Every small sound seemed magnified in the darkness, amplifying his sense of isolation. As he was turning down another aisle, Ethan heard a metallic clatter echo from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. He told himself it was probably just a loose pipe, or maybe something falling from one of the shelves, but the noise was distinct, almost deliberate. Ignoring the growing unease in his chest, Ethan decided to check it out. He aimed his flashlight in the direction of the sound, illuminating rows of shelves and stacks of boxes. Just as he was about to shrug it off, he caught a glimpse of something up ahead, a faint beam of light moving, just like his own flashlight. He squinted, trying to see clearly, but the light vanished as quickly as it appeared. He felt a chill run down his spine. No one was supposed to be there except him, and he hadn't seen any cars in the lot when he'd come in. His mind raced through possibilities. Could it be another guard he hadn't been told about? Or maybe a homeless person sneaking around for shelter? Ethan debated calling out, but ultimately decided against it. Instead, he cautiously approached the area where he'd seen the light, shining his flashlight around to get a better view. But the aisle was empty, just rows of crates stacked to the ceiling. He stood there for a moment, trying to convince himself he'd imagined it, but the eerie silence seemed to disagree. Continuing his rounds, Ethan noticed a faint, unpleasant smell drifting through the air. It was a musty, metallic odor, like rusted metal mixed with dampness. The smell was coming from the direction of one of the loading bays, a darker part of the warehouse. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to investigate. As he reached the loading bay, he noticed something disturbing. 2 sets of wet footprints leading away from the loading dock, weaving through the aisles. The sight of those footprints made his blood run cold. Whoever was in the warehouse wasn't just hiding. They were moving around, leaving a trail through the vast space. Ethan's nerves were now on edge, but he couldn't shake the need to know what was going on. He kept his flashlight low, trying not to draw attention to himself. The faint metallic smell grew stronger, almost overwhelming, as he followed the footprints deeper into the warehouse. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat reminding him of the increasing danger. Just as he turned another corner, he heard faint whispers drifting through the air. The voices were low and garbled, as though coming from far away, yet they sounded close enough to make out tense, urgent tones. He couldn't catch any specific words, but there was something unsettling about their rhythm, almost like the people speaking were arguing. Ethan switched off his flashlight, holding his breath as he crept closer. He strained his ears, trying to decipher what was being said. As he moved toward the source of the whispers, he raised his flashlight, hoping to catch whoever was there by surprise. But as he rounded the corner, his light revealed nothing but empty shelves and silence. The whispers had stopped. The absence of sound was even more unnerving than the voices had been. His mind raced, battling between the desire to investigate further and the instinct to leave immediately. He knew he had a job to do and that calling the police might be premature, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Just then, he heard another sound, a scraping noise like metal dragging across the floor. He swung his flashlight around and the beam landed on a metal tool lying just a few feet away. It was a crowbar, and it hadn't been there before. Ethan's hands began to tremble. This was no longer just a routine patrol. Someone had left that crowbar intentionally. He was sure of it. Mustering his courage, he called out, "Is someone here? You need to leave now or I'm calling the police." His voice echoed back at him, bouncing off the cold metal walls of the warehouse. There was no response, only silence. He scanned the area once more, but there was no one in sight. Feeling unnerved, Ethan decided it was time to reset the breaker and leave. He turned and made his way toward the circuit room, his flashlight guiding the way. But just as he approached the room, he heard a new sound, the unmistakable pounding of footsteps echoing from the far end of the building. Without thinking, he broke into a sprint, running toward the noise. As he turned the corner, he froze. Standing in the middle of the aisle were two shadowy figures, both dressed in black. One of them was holding a crowbar identical to the one he'd just seen on the floor. For a brief moment, they locked eyes with him. He could feel their gaze boring into him, a malicious intensity that sent a jolt of terror through his body. Then, without warning, the figures broke into a sprint, charging directly toward him. Panic surged through Ethan as he turned and ran, his heart pounding in his ears. The footsteps thundered behind him, growing louder as they closed the distance. He could hear their heavy breathing, the scrape of their boots on the floor. He weaved through the aisles, desperate to lose them, his flashlight bobbing wildly as he navigated the labyrinth of shelves. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps finally faded. Ethan ducked behind a stack of crates, catching his breath, his entire body trembling with fear. He listened carefully, trying to hear any sign of movement, but the warehouse was silent once more. After a few minutes, he mustered the courage to make his way to the exit. He crept along the walls, staying as close to the shadows as possible. The rain outside had intensified, hammering against the metal walls like a relentless drumbeat. When he finally reached the door, he stepped outside, letting the cold rain soak through his clothes. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone and dialed 911, his voice barely steady as he reported the intruders. The police arrived quickly and searched the warehouse, but the figures were gone, leaving no trace behind. The wet footprints had vanished, and there was no evidence of a break-in. Ethan tried to explain what had happened, but the officers seemed skeptical. His boss wasn't any more understanding, chastising him for abandoning his post and almost firing him. Ethan continued working there, but he was never alone on the night shift again. The memory of that night haunted him, and even though he never saw the intruders again, he never felt truly safe in the warehouse. Every time he walked down those aisles, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, lurking just beyond the edge of the flashlight's beam, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. If you love these kinds of spine-chilling stories and enjoy exploring the mysteries lurking in the dark, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Every story we share will take you deeper into the world of fear and suspense. Want to stay updated with our latest horror tales? Hit the bell icon so you never miss a fright.